Right, so I'm Miro, and I've been making games for a bit. Exactly 3 of them. The first 2 are a little mobile puzzlers called Euclidean Lands and Euclidean Skies, and it's essentially about like these fights on a Rubik's Cube. And the third one is Loot River, which is the game that I'm going to be talking about now. What I'm mostly interested in is like the interaction between the player and the environment. So in all of the 3 games, the gameplay is actually about changing the environment rather than changing the player or playing with the player. And the first 2 games were I started as a student and did them alone and whatnot. And for the Loot River, I managed to convince Superhot and Slovakian Arts Council to actually fund the game. And I finally did it with a small team of awesome people, and it was a little bit bigger than the other one. Now, we somehow couldn't get a video working, so in case you don't know what the Loot River is about, I'm just going to quickly explain it. It's like you control this little character, but actually what you're doing is you're controlling these Tetris-like blocks, and you're reconfiguring the dungeon to overcome the enemies. And it's a rogue-like and kind of procedurally generated, and we're going to be talking about that today. So just to continue on the basic concept, so you understand what the game is about, it's like essentially it's meant for like Xbox controller. With one stick you control the platform, and with the other one you control the player, and you do all sorts of normal player actions as in top-down action game. And you can see like you can poke and kite the enemies and reconfigure all the blocks, and it's all happening inside this like generated dungeon that is new each run. And so you have all sorts of power-ups, and there are different types of platforms, stairs and whatnot. You see also like we have procedural generation on like the weapons, and you can like combine them and whatnot. There are different environments and biomes, right? And there are, boss fights. This one is also interesting from procedural perspective because we needed to do like procedural animations for the boss to catch the platforms, but that unfortunately didn't really fit into the talk. And you have the normal RPG system and like the hub and some characters and whatnot. But what this talk is about is actually only about generating the layout of the dungeon and the dungeon in itself. It's not going to focus on any of the other things, and we're going to look at this specifically because it posed some really interesting questions. Namely, this is kind of also a puzzle game, and like how do you do procedural generations when there's puzzles involved? And the talk is structured actually in a 3 sections First is like how we generate the layout and what's the logic behind it. Then we look into the content, which is like what is player actually doing, what's the core gameplay loop, and then I call it decoration, but it's mostly like our tile set and the blocks that the player is moving. So each of them is using different approaches to procedural generation, and it's all coming together. So this is like the basic layout for generating level called the last city. So essentially we all have every biome has a different sort of arbitrary rules into how you generate the blocks, right? And you spawn a couple of rooms, and since the gameplay of the game is only allowing for horizontal or vertical movement, we need to snap them to a grid, so you can actually only move horizontally or diagonally. You can't, horizontally or vertically, you can't move diagonally. And then, we see like that there are some corners, so we spawn like intermediate rooms and count all the rooms together, and then we see which rooms can branch where. So in this case, we could also branch from the start and from the end room, but in this level we ignore those. In some other biome we actually branch from those, but whatever. So this leaves us usually with 2 rooms, and then we look for the upper branching, where initially it was another branch of the dungeon that you go follow through, but then the dungeons were just too large. So right now it's just hosting like a merchant or some sort of special narrative room or whatever. And then we need to identify the flow in which the player is supposed to get in all of these branches from start to finish. So we always need to know how the player should be moving these platforms. And this gives us like the basic layout that actually in all of the generation of this level called last city, we keep the same rigid structure, and that is because it allows the player on subsequent runs to kind of just like orient themselves, you know, like to know where they are. So like when they arrive at a crossroads, they know like where they should go, like they get a feel for it, and they also understand that there's some sort of special events or special treats in certain types of corridors or in certain types of these turns, and they can follow through. So, but like when you look at this, it gets pretty repetitive pretty fast, right? Even like when you're within a certain bounding box and you spawn these rooms and they are limited to a certain number, it gets a little bit stale. So then what we do is we just sort of like fragment the basic layout further with some sort of rules, and then you start to see that it suddenly gets a little bit more interesting. Like you can still see that the basic layout and the basic flow and whatever we designed is still there, but then it gets somehow populated with more content and with more pathways to follow. And so this was all about like this last city level, but actually for all of the biomes or for all of the levels, we have different base structure at the beginning, which is how the level layout is generated. So, you know, you can have like a basic L shape, you can have some sort of O shape with like divisions in between, or like in here, it's just a straight line basically, because that's a chase sequence, or like some sort of branchable level with like 3 branches and quick returns, and then some sort of master room that you need to find. And essentially, you just specify these at the very beginning, and then you always follow through with the with the structure. So this is actually how then how the flow in the level works, right? So the dashed line here is like the intended flow of the player, and the thick line is how the player goes. Now, in here, in the first crossroads, it's kind of okay, because you know that the back is the way you came, and you can just select 2 ways, and you can go wherever. But it becomes kind of problematic on the second crossroad over there, because you have 2 pathways, and one of them leads to the exit or to your target, to where you want to go, and the other one just leads somewhere. And in the playtesting, this was often a problem, because players would just continue in the direction they were going, often miss the turn that they were supposed to make, and then you would get into the other part of the dungeon, which you were not really supposed to be in. You were going against the flow of the design that you were supposed to be having, and you were just kind of lost. And that was really not great, because players get frustrated very fast there. And the other problem was that when you generate these sort of corridors with this certain intended flow, that means you're coming from up, down. In this scenario, you can, you know, easily just drag down and continue, whatever. But if you were to arrive from the bottom and you were going up, you would get stuck in this simplified situation. And players would often feel that this is just a bad design, that although it was designed as it was supposed to be, they did not understand it, that they are just going in a wrong direction. So we needed to solve this problem. And we solved it with these sort of gates. Now, obviously, in level design, you could just literally have a trigger here and then close a gate or whatnot on the other side, right? And the player would go as they were intended. So, you couldn't go on the red ones, and it would always guide you to the exit. But since we had these sort of unique game mechanics, it was kind of interesting to play with those. And that is, so we used the platforms to prevent the player of going in the direction that that we didn't want them to go. And this seems overly simplistic now when I talk about it, but it was actually quite hard for us to figure out how to do it naturally. And yeah, you basically arrive from the bottom and you're stuck on this platform that you cannot move because there's an obstacle in the middle, so it's locked. And then you can only board the other platform and you go in the flow that was intended for you. And you often don't even see that there's something on the top, so it's not really bugging you that you missed something or that there's a problem. And then the same goes in this simplistic scenario as well. But what this is also pointing towards is more like pre-made rooms, right? This is no longer procedural, but this is designed. but we'll get to that in a bit. Now, in the early versions of the game, we had these sort of blocks that were spawned on the grid, whatever, with some density, randomly, whether selected from pool or generated procedurally. You would be on a block, and you would move the block, get on a second block, and so on, and it kind of worked, right? If you don't have your border corroded too much, you cannot ever get stuck, and you sort of continue. But then, to make the game more interesting, we introduced elevated blocks. So, once you're on a ground floor, and in these ideal situations, you would get on the stairs, you would drag the stairs there, and then you would get on the stairs and go down, right? This seems okay, but I guess you can already see where the problem with this would be. And that situations like these is like, you arrive at a block, and suddenly you cannot push the block through the opening, right? And yeah, you could possibly here go back, select a smaller block and pass through. And in some cases, these also introduce like kind of nice puzzles. But in some cases, this really produced problems. And it would happen sooner or later that you would arrive at like a sort of knot like this that you couldn't pass through. Like it was simply impossible. And like you can do certain things to mitigate these, but eventually they kept popping in. Like whatever we did, they at some point were still introduced, and maybe we were just bad at puzzling, or maybe they really were impassable. But it was quite a problem because initially Loot River was like a fast-paced co-op game where the camera is moving, and when you got outside of the camera, you died and you were respawned. And it was fine, when something like this knot was introduced, because you simply died and respawned and whatever, you moved on, and it was fun. But what's not fun is when you have a roguelike where you like work on your build, work on your character for an hour or something, and then suddenly you get to like this sort of knot and you cannot continue, and it's not because it's your problem as a player, but it's because it's a problem of the developer, that the game was simply badly designed for your continuation. And then you get really frustrated and angry, and there's just no way around it, reasonable. Because you can do some sort of things, like you can allow the player then to teleport to the other platform or whatever, somehow mitigate these, but then it sort of defeats the purpose of the puzzle in this game. So the entire elevated blocks just became pointless. And we started searching for a solution to this problem. And yeah, this is how we did it. So basically, this is the layout that you all saw before. And then we split the layout into evenly sized rooms, right? So in this case, I think it was 20 by 20 units. And then obviously, in some cases like this is the direction down, and we knew that there was nothing in any of these generations in there. And you can, in the initial rules, you can also make sure that there is nothing, so you can extend the rooms, or you can make them lower, or whatever you need. You can just sort of play it. And then we populated this with actually pre-made rooms. And this got suddenly very interesting because in the pre-made rooms, you could really design it, and you could really make interesting puzzles, and you could make alternative branches, and you could make like hidden paths, and you could make like intentional level design with enemy placement and all sorts of interesting things. But it's also, a lot of designing and move away from the procedural things. But this also meant that player never really gets stuck, right? So they have more interesting playthrough. They should not get frustrated with the level design, with like getting stuck, and it allows us to do more, but on the cost of actually producing them. And then this is just a visualization of how the player is moving through the dungeon, and we have a bunch of stuff that is already decided on the seed, that is just generated, being enabled and disabled based on the approach. Some of the stuff that is being generated only when the player is about to seed, to like save the memory cost, performance cost, and then we have some stuff that is being baked real time, like obviously navigation meshes and whatnot. And for this to work, now we needed like a lot of these rooms, a lot of prefabs. Like I'm talking like hundreds of prefabs for a single biome, for a single direction that we were going in. And it was like, there was really like labor-intensive work. So this here is just a small portion of the last city biome vertical direction up that we needed. And this here is like a schema of what we actually do need to produce for the level, right? So in the top box over there, you can see these are the main gameplay corridors, right? So this is where the actual gameplay is happening, and you need to have a lot of them. And then you have these sort of like turns, which you know is usually a specified amount in the level. And then we have these gates that we already described. And this is also kind of nice because it allows us to basically break the pacing of the level. So you know you have some sort of puzzling and fighting going on, and then you have some sort of turn where you can place a merchant or a special thing, or just give a player some sort of resting time or connection to other level or whatever, or sort of like a special event going up, and then it breaks down again into these tunnels, right? And so, this was kind of like the dead cells approach, right? Having rooms and putting them together. But you also needed to, since we have this unique navigation going on there, you need to be really careful about how you assemble it. And so each of these biomes and each of these directions and each of these flows that we have needed to have a special rules that we set for Ryan, who was doing the level design, which was essentially like which direction you're going to. And each room needed to have a start and end condition. And in the case of this one, it was that there needed to be 6 tiles that were accessible by platform on ground floor, right? So this enables us to always connect to the other room, and then obviously the border so the player cannot get out of the map. So what it essentially does is, like in this simple case, you do some sort of puzzling, you push this platform through, whatever, you do something here, maybe you select this, and you again exit on a small platform on ground floor. And then, this is a very simple case, you just push through. And then in the last case, you see you kind of switch to the red, which is the elevated platforms. But as you finish the puzzling or whatever is happening inside this room, you board the stairs and you get down again on the ground floor, and you exit this room on the ground floor. Now, obviously, you can play a lot with this, so the level doesn't really feel divided into rooms. And since they are selected randomly, you somehow get rooms that are more connected than others, and sometimes less. But so you're not limited to the 20 by 20 block. We also check for in the level design, like which rooms can extend in which directions, right? Like if you have just a level that is just a straight line going like this, obviously you can extend up and down and do whatever, or like the corner rooms can extend essentially infinitely outwards, or as we saw earlier in the last city direction down, it extended on the sides, but this was a special case because we also introduced another openings that that were essentially like the main level flow that gets alternated just from the center line, but you could sort of meander through it all. And you can see it here on these, in the first flooded village level, you essentially have 2 main paths that you can go through, and it extends up or down or does whatever. And in here, these are the mandatory transitions, the rectangles, right? So that's always open and it connects to the other rooms. In this case, it was the turn rooms. And then you have the optional room transitions, which are essentially these corridors that are, like these borders that are closed, but when it detects it's nearby and aligned with another border, it opens up. And then when it detects there's nothing in between, it stays closed. But essentially, it does a nice flow, so you can sort of, it breaks the level and make it feel more random and more actually procedural and more unpredictable, even though it's really just designed. And as I said, we needed a lot of the rooms. So this is like a gift from our level editor that actually we're now making this available also for players to share and design their own levels. I mean, you see you sort of just have your configuration with the 2 open parts where you cannot really place anything except for the ground floor tile. And then you just sort of quickly go through. And this is really Really fast process, actually. So we were able to generate a lots of rooms. Yeah, Ryan was, poor guy, able to do it. And this brings us to the design of the platforms, right? So inside these rooms are these platforms that the player is standing on, right? And to not have it too boring, the platform usually consists of the tile, the base tile, and then some sort of decoration, like you have like the little bricks and the walls and the columns and the vases and some sort of a litter on top of it and a bunch of stuff to make it more visually appealing. And this is for the ground play in the level that we were talking about now. This is the elevated platform, right? So you have all of the other things, except you also need the decoration for the wall, and you also need to have stairs. Now, stairs are always just horizontal, because vertical stairs don't have any silhouette, and because of the perspective shortcomings, they were not, of the view shortings, they were not really well visible. And then you needed to take all these sets and generate it for all the other biomes, right? So all the other biomes needed to have their variations, their decorations, their everything. So it was actually a lot of tile drawings. And so let's take a look at how the platforms are actually working, how the islands are assembled. So at the bottom, we have the base collider, which is actually all the functionality of our tile, of the single tile. Then we have the navigation mesh, which is essentially just a quad. And when it's connected to other quad, it like welds and you're able to do AI navigation on it. And then we have a reflection sprite, which is actually, this doesn't get rendered into the normal camera, but this gets only rendered to the water. I don't know if you remember, but we had like pretty dope water simulation going on there. And for all of these, we actually needed to draw fake reflections. And then we have the wall sprite, which was like this brick sort of thing, and the decoration for the wall sprite. Since wall sprites are usually only 3, it gets repetitive fast. So then we just sort of like smash some other stuff on top to make it less repetitive. And the same goes for platform sprite, which is essentially your basic tiles, and the decoration on the platform sprite, which is some sort of stone or moss or whatnot. And then we have the platform shadow mesh. This is kind of, like our game is pixel art, but it does have as well like this sort of illumination and shadows working on it. And this is done through having an invisible objects actually calculating this light information and then projecting it into game. And then we have the gameplay objects, which is usually meshes, sometimes sprites, but even the meshes have like a shader that actually does them into a tilted sprite sort of thing. And then we have obviously decoration sprites such as walls or like columns or what have you. And if they are bigger, they also need shadow meshes for that modeled. And this is how the tile selection actually works. So it's, I think, pretty straightforward, right? You have a node in the middle that you want to occupy, and then it checks in all the directions around it, like what is there and what the conditions are, and then it spawns it. Initially, it only checked the 4 directions, but we wanted to have like nice chamfered corners and some sort of better art style going on. So we needed to also check for the diagonals, because like, you see it's significantly different tile if you have it occupied here versus if you don't, like otherwise there would be a gap. So this is, this is pretty simple. You can achieve it with a bunch of if conditions or whatever. And these are like the examples of the platforms that you can generate, and you can see what sort of tile work you actually need for this simple 5-piece platform, right? The middle one and then the corners. Sorry. And then this is just a quick note about like the additional generation on top that's also fairly straightforward. Like for example, for enemies, we specify some sort of density per biome that gets increased or decreased based on how you progress and what your stats are and what your level is, and then it essentially just populates like every 4th node or something on random, right? And this is how it actually looks in the editor. So how occupying different tile position changes the overall look of the platform. And these are the tiles that are essentially needed for a single floor, so either ground floor or elevated floor and a single biome. Like the top ones, they are the basic ones, and then the bottom ones, these just exist because of the decision to have these little chamfers there. I'm not entirely sure it was worth it. And then you have obviously the stair sprite, and these are the wall sprites, and the wall sprite for the stairs, and then some sort of litter on top to break down the repetitiveness of the platforms. And then you have all sorts of these structural decorations, which required also meshes. So like columns, walls, what have you, and then you have the decoration for the terrain. And all of these needed to be done for both ground floor, elevated floor, and for all of the biomes. So yeah, we had Francesco working on it a lot. And then, because of our special rendering system with the shadows, we also, for all of this, needed actually shadow meshes, so like properly modeled and fitting on the pixel grid meshes, right? And we're using top-down view, but it's sort of like, you know, axonometric kind of fake thing, but that essentially resulted in all of these meshes not being modeled in proper perspective, but it's sort of skewed perspective, which was another sort of madness. And it made the modeling really difficult, but we also could, to an extent, generate it from the sprites, right? When you have just a pixel art wall, you can split the pixel art wall into the pixels, and you can generate mesh around the pixels because it's a very simple thing since it's on a grid. And this is then how the platform itself looks in the editor, right? It doesn't really make any sense when you look at it like this, but when you look at it from top, everything aligns. So you see we have like these sort of wonky sprites. They are part of the reflection, so they don't really get rendered, they just get taken into the water map and then distorted. Then we have like the walls, and then we have the basic sprites, some litter, then you see the purple is the shadow mesh that gets on top. And then you have like the tilted sprites for the other objects. We didn't want to use like normal sprite sorting because we started with that, but it got really complicated really fast. So at some point we were just like, let's just tilt it and use the normal depth to sort it instead, because you keep moving these things around and one gets in front of the other, and then keeping track of everything just gets really messy when you could just simply tilt everything and be fine. And then you see here a player. I don't know if you can really see it, but he's essentially a sprite on a plane. It gets a little bit smoothed, so he doesn't ever intersect with the ground floor. And now we only have like 30 minutes, but there are other procedural things used in the game, such as maybe the water, or like in this case we have the meshes of the blood being generated when you kill enemies in between those, or like, as I said, like the IK animation for the hand, but I think we don't really have time for that today, so thank you.